Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. And welcome to Open In for Live. Open In for Live is our interactive show where we talk about all things open infrastructure. I'm Mark Collier. I'll be your host today. We have some amazing guests coming on, and we are live streaming to YouTube as well as LinkedIn. And we encourage you to put in your comments, your questions throughout the show, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. We want to try to keep it interactive. Before we get started, I want to thank all of the members of the Open Infra Foundation, these organizations that make it possible for us to do what we do, including putting on these Open Infra Live episodes. So today, we're going to talk about what's been happening in open source lately and kind of the intersection with AI and all the different crazy things that are happening. I think if you think about open source, it's so much bigger than it was when we all got started a decade plus ago, some of us even longer. Working in open source, it's gotten so much bigger and so much more attention is attached to it that we're starting to see more and more examples where people want to grab that attention. They want to call their effort, their initiative open source, and they get that attention. It usually works. The press like to pick it up. A lot of times you'll see a lot of examples where companies come out and say, look, I've got this open source initiative or this other open source activity, and the press kind of just repeats it oftentimes. So go through a few quick examples. Certainly in the world of AI, you see Meta had their Llama and then their Llama 2. And look, it's great that they're creating more open access, in my opinion, to these powerful AI systems, these tools, these large language models. But claiming it's open source really doesn't match the definitions that we have come to understand about open source, particularly some of the commercial restrictions on use. And it's a complex world when it comes to AI. We've got some great guests today to talk about what open source even means or open means in the context of AI. But if we kind of keep going through some of these examples, we also saw in the next slide, IBM and NASA open sourced this geospatial AI foundation, published at the Hugging Face. Alibaba, and the next example there's another one about Meta. Meta got a lot of headlines you may have seen. And then Alibaba released their model. And, in some of these cases, there are restrictions on who can use it. If you're one of the FANG companies, you can't use it for commercial use. So a lot of those restrictions really run directly into conflict with the very definitions of open source that we have agreed upon. The OSI, the Open Source Initiative, we have their executive director on to talk about this very topic. And even if you talk about Llama 2, I asked Llama 2 itself, with a hosted version that I found A16Z had put out, what is your license, Llama 2? And it said MIT. That's very much wrong. It's not MIT at all. But of course, these large language models, these AIs, they've been known to hallucinate. So I kind of went back with a few more follow-up questions that eventually confessed to the fact that, in fact, it wasn't an OSI approved license. Now, of course, every time you get a different answer when you ask these large language models questions. So this was just something I did for my own amusement, but eventually, yes, it did acknowledge it's not an OSI license. So this move towards more open is a good thing, I think, in my opinion, in AI, but it's important, in my opinion, that we actually take seriously the definitions around this. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And lastly, I want to mention another trend that's been happening the last few years, which is relicensing. This is really not specific to AI. It's just another example where you see companies that are investing in certain open source projects and kind of backing away from what we would consider a true open source license to source available. There's a lot of different examples of this. And even if the license isn't changing, we see examples where other forms of restrictions are being put in place because companies are feeling the competitive threats, perhaps different motivations, but we're seeing this continue to happen, and so it calls into question, I think, what is the definition of open source? How much does it matter? And we've got a great set of guests to talk through this with us today. One of those guests is Stephen O'Grady, and he actually just published an article a few days ago, Why Open Source Matters, speaks directly to the heart of this issue. And so now that we're on stream, let's invite Stephen on. And Stephen, why don't you talk a little bit about your background, and then we'll bring the rest of the guests on.
Sure. So I'm Stephen O'Grady. I'm the co-founder of RedMonk, and I've been, let's say, sort of researching and writing about open source for a lot longer than I would care to admit. Dating back to some of the origins of these projects, have traced sort of the histories of these licenses, have worked with sort of many companies in this space, sort of around navigating licenses, in some cases, sort of working with them on relicensing efforts. So yeah, I've been in the space for a long time, and as you might have gathered from the piece, I have pretty strong opinions. I would suspect, like a lot of our panelists, about the value of the open source term, and sort of what the definition is, and sort of why we need to defend it.
Wonderful. Let's bring Pam on next to introduce herself, and then we'll bring the rest of the guests on and get started.
Hi, Pam Chestek. I have a firm called Chestek Legal. It's my firm. I've been working in open source software for probably about, I don't know, between 12 and 14 years now. My first experience was at a proprietary software company where I read the licenses and kind of thought I knew what they meant. And then I got a job at Red Hat and learned what open source really was about. And I've been working in that field ever since. I have all kinds of clients. I have both proprietary clients who want to understand their compliance obligations for the open source licenses. I have open source foundations. I have projects that companies and people who want to figure out what kind of license is the best for their work. And frankly, sometimes the answer is not an open source license, depending on what their goals are. So I've been working in this field now for probably 12 to 14 years, and just I'm really endlessly fascinated because it's such a, and I think maybe I would comment on this later, is the way that the communal development and community around open source as a result of having made these license choices. Having set up the OSD and the growth that allowed, which I just find a really fascinating social statement. So that's
wonderful. Well, thank you for joining us. We're super lucky to have you. And on that note, why don't we bring Stefano in, and he can introduce himself as our next panelist.
You're on mute, Stefano.
Okay, we may have to come back to Steph. I can introduce him, but I probably won't do it justice. But Stefano is the Executive Director at Open Source Initiative. They are directly at the heart of this question of defining and maintaining the definition of open source. So we're excited to have him on. Steph, are you?
Is it working now?
On?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry for that. Sound issues. I'm the Executive Director at the Open Source Initiative. I've been in working and dealing with open source for many years, probably before open source as a term even existed. I can't trace it back, but in any case, I came to software from as a user. I'm not a developer. I just noticed how much time I was spending as a software user trying to figure out who I should talk to in order to get the software to be modified, that I was using to be modified, and I thought that was wrong. So I discovered the GNU Manifesto, the GNU project, and I fell in love with those concepts. I started advocating and basically never stopped, from different angles, from nonprofit work to corporations, other nonprofits, and now back into an open source world, nonprofit world.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us. Next, we're going to bring Armstrong on to introduce himself.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, I'm Armstrong, a research scientist at Zero Dependable and Explainable Learning. It's a project at the University of Montreal. So my focus is on certifiability of deep learning models and making safety critical system. I'm investigating safety critical system like aircraft transportations and this kind of medical systems. But before focusing on that, I did my PhD on open source software ecosystems. And it matters a lot to me when we talk about open source because I have benefited from it. I have seen the values it brings and breaks barriers across different sectors. It brings things explainable, transparent, and builds a whole lot of collaborations that we cannot even imagine. So this can, even my research work right now, I really am enthusiastic about the context of open source, especially in the AI domain, which is also building into a massive ecosystems. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, it's great to have somebody with your background as we get deeper into the AI topic. I think to sort of open things up here with the first question, I want to actually kind of pause on AI for a second, just because it brings a lot of complexity into the debate and the conversation about what we mean by open or open source, and just kind of step back to the general open source definition and just kind of ask you all, like, why does this matter? Like, I think we can definitely all see that there is a lot of there are a lot of actors out there that have this motivation to call their thing open source, and we have a definition. It just clearly doesn't meet it, and there are more and more examples of this, or companies just acknowledging, hey, I'm not going to be open source anymore. But in either case, I guess the question is just like, why does it matter that we actually have a clear definition and that we hold people to it? And maybe I'll start with Stephen, because I think you've done a lot of writing on this, and then whoever wants to jump in next, feel free.
Yeah, I think it's actually pretty simple, right? In the sense that, the definition itself, was the product of a lot of work. And it was, essentially the definition is something that is, kind of the sort of least possible restrictions that will work at scale, right? So the difficulty is that, you'll hear vendors come along and say, we've already mentioned Facebook. So they have a couple of projects, Llama most notably, right? That says, here's the source is available. And, it comes with these sort of restrictions, right? In their case, it's commercial restrictions, and restrictions vary, right? And that's part of the problem, in the sense that if you have a bunch of licenses, all of which carry, sort of differing arbitrary restrictions, depending on, who set them up, that's a problem longer term. Right. So, look, if you are a vendor and you want to introduce, sort of a particular restriction on a license, that's your right. Like, if you wrote the software, you can license it however you want. But, the thing that, a lot of us are insisting on is just don't confuse it with open source. You can make the source available, but for it to be open source, it has to be available under the definition that we've all come to understand over multiple decades. Right. And you see all sorts of people arguing, well, developers don't care. Well, they don't care because they haven't had to. They've never been subject, to these sort of, arbitrary restrictions that, among other things, don't allow developers to recombine software in different ways, as, again, they've sort of been entitled to, sort of courtesy the definition so far. So basically, the definition means something to the whole industry. And if that definition is compromised, it doesn't mean anything, in which case open source as a term of, that describes a particular set of values and behaviors and permissions, it becomes meaningless at that point. So the thing, that's, to me, it's, people want to center the debate on how things are licensed. I don't, that's not for me to say. To Pam's point earlier, there are circumstances where an open source license just isn't appropriate. Okay, but that's fine. But just don't call something open source just because you want the marketing benefit of that term.
Pam, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I can't hardly find anything to say beyond what Stephen said, because he said it so well. I would also say that, there's just an expectation when you use software in an open source license. There are no where the guardrails are on what you can and cannot do with that software, and they're very minimal, right? It's providing attribution. It might be having to make the source code available with certain licenses, but everybody knows where the guardrails are, and these very low guardrails are, and it gives them a great deal of freedom to operate, freedom to make choices, freedom to improve. I'm sort of hearkening back on what Armstrong said in his introduction, which is, you have room to run, and you don't have to worry about where the fences are when you have open source software. And as soon as people start to so when you go into the proprietary world, you understand you have to read the license, you have to understand that maybe you only have so many seats, or other kinds. So you implement procedures. Ideally, you have implemented procedures to make sure that you don't breach that license. But there's a lot of overhead in doing that, and so this just gives the open source license, and as defined by the open source definition, just gives so much freedom to operate that is lacking if it's not an OSI approved open source license that has ratified that, yes, these you have these freedoms that are available to you. So I just think that people are kind of missing that aspect when of the open source ecosystem and why it works.
Yeah, for me, it's very tied to my personal experience, because when I was a student in architecture, one of the first lessons I got from my professors was to go out into building sites and ask for permission to enter as a student and learn how things were put together, like beams and pillars were attached, or read other books and read magazines where the description was done about how a building or a square was designed, starting from sketches all the way to the final prints. And that experience I could not replicate when I started to use software. Like when I started to use CAD, I had to not only go through multiple steps in procurement of the software, but also once I received it, I needed to procure even more plugins, extensions, all sorts of other things that were required painful negotiations with the head of the department at the university where I was working. I had to negotiate with the sales vendors. The sales teams, contact them. It was, multi-thousands dollars worth of licenses, and it was just painful. And that pain was removed when I understood that there was there were the free software license, the open source licenses, where you knew you could download packages from the internet. You could even pay consultants, or you could pay a vendor to download packages and use them, but also build on top of that and have complete freedom and control of the solutions that you were building. That to me was the life-changing environment.
Yeah, more to what the other panelists have said, I look at open source as a culture. Being a culture means we have a heritage that we need to preserve and to grow it sustainably. When we look at our human cultures that exist around the world, if you make certain statements, people might label you anti-Semitism and this and that, xenophobia and things like that, and even the law will come after you. We in the open source world, we also feel threatened when people are violating that space by claiming something to be when it is not. Is it by design? Is it by any other form of intention or not? But we have, for example, Stefan and Pam, they have said it in many beautiful ways. We still have to define and try to accommodate this new changing environment that AI is bringing. We know very much that AI has been in the world for many, many more years. So they are not ignorant about open source. They did not just have the enabling technology to do what they are doing now. And it is thanks to open source that they were able to build what they have right now. They cannot sabotage open source if they are doing it intentionally. But I just hope it is not an intentional design. We may come to that later.
Thank you. I really appreciate all the different perspectives, and they all definitely are very cohesive in the whole. And to me, like, one of the takeaways that I'm hearing is that during this kind of decade plus boom of open source, where we if you go back far enough, you can find the time when a lot of companies were very scared of open source. They didn't want to touch it. And a lot of that had to do with, like, the legal departments, right? They didn't understand it. What does it mean to bring this into my company? And the friction that was dramatically reduced by defining what it means, particularly with a certain set of licenses, that those attorneys could understand, read, and see, okay, well, my peers, the other Fortune 500 companies, what have you, they're adopting things that are Apache or MIT or whatever the different. I don't want to get into the licenses, into the weeds on that, but once they become understood, okay, I understand if it's one of these licenses, this is kind of generally what it means. It just really reduced the friction for adoption and experimentation in these companies, and that's what led to this boom. And I think that, as Stephen pointed out, new licenses come out. I mean, that creates a huge barrier, regardless of what they say. Even if they say something that's not too far afield from existing licenses, you now have legal teams at all these companies that have to go, what does this mean? I've never seen this one before. And they just put the brakes on it. And I think that's one of the things that is at stake if we let kind of this proliferation of new things pop up and call themselves open source without kind of like the culture and the consensus building that, as Armstrong very eloquently pointed out. So that's a couple 2 cents for me. But the next question I want to ask is not necessarily about licensing in that side of it, but just kind of broaching into the subject of AI. And really, I want to talk about just why do any of us feel it's important that AI as a technology, this powerful new technology, you can use the large language model example, which is the LLM, like a chat GPT is kind of the one that's caught everyone's imagination. But why is it actually important that that type of technology be accessible, be open to people? I think there's debates about that. Some people say absolutely it shouldn't be, and some people say absolutely it should be. I think we probably all come more from the side of wanting things to be more open. But what is important about that? And I just want to maybe even start with Steph on this, because I think he has just started a thread recently in a group that I've started participating in. And one of the questions he asked is, before we talk about defining it, like, why does it actually matter? And I think this comes back to some of the culture questions too. Steph, what are your thoughts on it?
Well, I'm trying to build my opinion on this. We just started a little over a year ago, I gotta say, and maybe it's worth reminding people that the open source definition came out 25 years ago, but after decades of existence of the GNU Manifesto, the practice of releasing software in the open, the GNU licenses, the GNU project. So there was a lot of practice, there was a lot of understanding, and kind of a coherent or organic evolution of computer software, computer science, and an open source that went hand in hand. With AI, defining and thinking about what open means in this context is coming a little bit rushing, accelerating with the evolution of technology in the recent months or weeks even. So why I started thinking about this with the open source initiative is because I think we need a framework as communities and as society. We need a framework to replicate the kind of, to have some sort of tooling to explain to people why with the evolution of science, computer science and software, we want to replicate that in the AI space. Like, we want to have a way to control the technology, to understand the technology, how it's being deployed, and ultimately we want to be able to tell the policymakers, if you're creating a digital space, if you're creating a world where machines are capable of deciding who goes to jail or not, who gets a mortgage, who has the right to cross the street in front of a car that is driverless, we as a society, we need to have a profound understanding of what went into producing those machines and explain why they are behaving one way or another, and ultimately write laws and norms and regulations that allow us as society to keep control of these machines. Right. So in order to do that, we need to understand the same way that we've been telling the policymakers that they needed to create website that worked in a way with standards that could be implemented on any computer. Right. When the internet started to boom and digital services started to be irrigated from the governments to citizens, we wanted to have full access to those tools. We need to have a similar way for AI.
Yeah, so it sounds like one of the clear examples that are reasons you're giving is transparency. So like we see the rise of these technologies. I think everyone has a sense now, especially since ChatGPT and just a short number of months, all these new models have been released, that we're finally starting to see glimpses of this kind of sci-fi AI powerful thing that has been written about in sci-fi for decades. And now we're saying, well, this actually looks like there's something there, but if we're going to then inevitably rely on it as society, governments, you talked about policing, like these are very heavy topics, right? That if we don't know how they work, or we don't have the transparency that comes from the openness that we've come to know from the open source sort of software world, then that's a concern. So that seems like one really clear example where why we would want to have sort of openness in these sorts of designs. Does anybody else want to jump in on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say, I think in addition, as Steph sort of outlined, right, there are clear societal incentives, right, to make these technologies as transparent, sort of as possible. But also, in other words, at RedMonk, we spend our time sort of, essentially researching and writing on behalf of practitioners, and there are, huge practical implications, for this, right, in the sense that, even if we set the, sort of the societal transparency requirements aside, just from a practical standpoint, if you're a developer, we have seen, as I said, sort of at the top, RedMonk's been doing this for a long time. We have seen generation after generation after generation of new technology come up. This is by far the fastest growing we have seen, and arguably the most important. And if we sort of end up in a world where, these technologies are not open, they're not sort of easily worked upon or understood by engineers, that's just, practically speaking, that's just a loss. And, at a minimum, we, in a perfect world, they'd be open to all participants. They would be truly open source, and we could all sort of work on them without reference to, sort of where somebody works, or how many, sort of how much revenue the company generates, or how many users they have, right? As some of the restrictions placed on these technologies are currently imposing, that'd be the perfect world. But short of that, is it ideal to have, sort of in Llama as an example, a technology that is open unless you work at Google or Amazon or Microsoft? Not really, but at a minimum, we have access to the source code. So that at least is an improvement. So like I said, I think, as you take this apart, there are really big, important societal reasons, but then there are just sort of day-to-day, sort of practical implications for engineers, for these technologies being, at least source available, and ideally open source.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm glad you kind of mentioned the Llama one again. We've kind of beat up on Meta and Llama for kind of using the open source term when it doesn't meet the definition, which is fair, but at the same time, I do think this is all moving very fast, and generally speaking, like what they've made available is more available, more accessible than sort of say like OpenAI, which is, even though it has OpenAI in the name of their company, is really by and large much less open than sort of like the Llama example. So you have this sort of spectrum, and I think that having the definition clear does matter, but also this is, we should acknowledge probably some steps in the right direction for transparency, and people working on trying to repeat it and understand what it actually does. So a net positive probably for this, but not quite meeting the standard. Armstrong, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, I think they have really elaborated much on it, and I'm really in line with what they said. So I don't really have much to add here.
Okay, good. Well, in that case, why don't we go on?
Can I just,
oh, sorry. Yes, Pam.
Yeah, I was just going to comment, just kind of actually to sort of put together what Stefano and Stephen said, which is, I think, another aspect that we're seeing in AI, and I agree with Stephen that this is sort of monumental in how quickly it's grown, is the consolidation of power. that exists at this moment in time. And maybe that won't be true for the long term, but at the moment we have a great deal of consolidation of power in AI, which I think is another reason why we need to be transparent. We need to have transparency into it.
Yeah, I love that point, Pam. I think, personally, just from my point of view, I think, anytime you see concentrations of power happening, and that's kind of the pendulum swinging that way, like a lot of unpleasant side effects can come along with that. And I think that's been one of the great hopes and results that have been driven by open source, is kind of a more evenly distributed. They say, the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed yet. I think open source has helped kind of counterbalance that trend, and now we see kind of it people backing away from it. And I think that concentration of power is absolutely a fundamental reason why we need to take this seriously. And even when it comes to things like regulation, people talk about regulatory capture, and you have to maybe kind of question some of the lobbying and motives behind that as well, if it's ultimately just going to benefit a very small number of players. So all worthwhile things to keep in mind. So as we go more deeply on this AI topic, I want to actually talk about why it isn't as cut and dry, I think, as it has been in sort of the software world. And certainly AI is much bigger than just even generative AI or large language models. But even if we just zero in on the large language model, LLM, because that's kind of the hot topic of the day, because that's sort of the chat GPT thing that more people are getting exposed to. If you look at that world, it's much different than sort of what we are used to from software, which is, okay, we have the source code. If I have the source code, I can compile it and turn it into a binary, and it will match exactly the binary that someone else produces. And so I can essentially reproduce the final output in the binary form coming straight from source code. But in the world of large language models, I'm just getting started. I'm very early in the learning curve, but I understand there are a lot of different components. It's not just about sort of software. If you want to recreate the final result, there's many other components to it. And I wanted to maybe ask Armstrong and Stefano both, have a lot of investigations going on in this area, but maybe we can start with kind of just understanding what are some of the different pieces that could potentially be open or not, that are not just about sort of the software side of it.
Okay. So it's really interesting you link these models, the AI models, with software development, because things turns to be like the reverse order. For example, in software engineering, we always start with some requirements. We try to get things adjusted at that level, know what is how we are defining classes, functions, and things, right up to the development of that model itself. But here in the machine learning world in general, we are talking about data and how to feed those models on data. Different types of models exist. Some are permit me to use the language black box or white box. It has been used, but I mean, for inclusive reasons, if I have a better name, I'll use it. When they talk about these black boxes, what are they? These are where we start. This is a starting point where we have to get worried even when we are talking about the openness, because explainability at this point is low. Now, once we talk about training a model, what does that entail? We have some data. We have some observations that we have seen. That data comes in a distribution, the way it is created. Now we want a mathematical model that could mimic the behavior to understand that data. That is that model that we are talking about. But as the model gets complex, even the best mathematical formulation cannot explain that same model the mathematics was used to design. That is where things now start getting really off hands. Even without being open source or closed source, let's just focus on the model itself. When we start training that model when fitting on data to see how it performs. Let's take example, a deep learning model with neurons, multi-layer perceptrons. As the layers increases, we don't actually can tell which particular neuron contribute to what extent to the final decision that will happen. This is the place where explainability research is going on there. And the more we are talking about AI scale, we are talking about foundational model, which is a generalized form of this generative model, where you can train the model with massive amount of data and use it with any kind of downstream task. This is leading to a new variety of AI that we have not yet seen, but they are working on right now in research, which is AGI, artificial general intelligence. It's far more than, I mean, we are not very close, we are not even close there, but research is heavily going in that direction. When we put all these things together, we see that by the time a decision is taken, either a prediction or a generative kind of output, many other factors, the training of the model comes with weight, with biases, that's what we call the parameters of that model. When we talk about 75 billion parameters, we know the vast amount of data that was trained, the different combinations of that parameter, with different weights and biases. It gives some certain outcomes. It's a complex procedure that we may not really go in depth in here, but just at the surface level. At this point, it is difficult to tell anyone that if your model functions, let's say 95% or 98% accurate, what does that mean? What happens if, let's be concrete, your model is 98% accurate? Wow, beautiful. What does that mean? How can you explain the 2% that is having an issue? What does that mean to somebody who wants to use that model? For example, you go to a medical test and everybody is, oh, it's very accurate, and they wrongly predict you, and that was like your last chance to obtain something. The catastrophe of that in an aircraft, 1% chance of failure may occur after, but what if you are the one traveling at that moment that the plane will crash? So all those kind of things, explainability needs to come in. So we have two types of openness here. The openness that might come in intentionally not releasing the entire license or making the entire license open source, or they don't have the bad intention of not, but the model itself places restriction. And this is what is happening in the field of open AI. Not because they don't want to release it, but the complexity of the model makes it hard to understand what is happening inside. And this is one of the reasons I believe research should really bring itself closer to the open source world, so that many eyes could look at some of these things. I think Mark made a very interesting statement, and even Stefan. How will you tell me, for example, in America, it has been studied and published in the literature, the biases in data that disfavor Black males? It's well known in the literature. And when you look into the algorithm, it was hugely biased. So open source is I can call it the police, the fairness police that we could use in this setup. Because if you tell me that my model predict that, for example, I was traveling to Heathrow one time. The immigration officer told me we are doing a random search and our algorithm randomly selects you for a search. I said, beautiful. I like the word random. Can I know how your random generator works? I like to submit, but I just want to be sure that we are not biased here. He could not explain to me. He went to his boss, and later on asked me to go. I said, but no, I'm not breaking the law. I just want you to explain how the algorithm works for I to be selected. And that was the end. So we can go on, and you realize that explaining how the training of this model works, at some time it's difficult, not because of malicious intent, but the nature of the algorithm themselves. At some other point, people might be using the wrong algorithm to solve a problem. The data is available. And many people, for example, let's talk about the large language models. I will come in from the point of the footprint, the carbon footprints, the number of GPUs, of processing powers to train one of such model is expensive, and it produces a lot of carbon waste. Now, if every company keeps producing it like that, how are we doing with global warming? How are we doing with the carbon footprint? What if they make it open source for people now to reuse, like what Hugging Face is doing? This is a good example of something that we can start learning from. If it is there, we learn from the Hugging Face, and then the paradigm they are using, we can now leverage to make AI in a very open source. Just to concretize what I've been saying in this aspect, I've talked about the foundational model, which is a generalized form of this large language model, which is what we are seeing right now. It has billions of parameters, as I said. This parameter comes in from the higher the dimension of the data, the higher the dimension of those parameters, because we'll be having what is called weights and biases to make that prediction or that training to really come into a high accuracy, or a form that can learn. There are other things that happens. Studies have shown that they are training models to do something, but that model end up learning skills to do some other task that was never trained to do. This zero-shot problem is common in most of these generative models. So they have tremendous powers to do things that research itself has not conclusively agreed that they understand fully. A few days back, what Joshua Benjo was talking at the Congress in the United States, he made a kind of expensive statement on open source, comparing open source with nuclear, the atomic bomb, that is why they should not release this technology to open source. I was really mad at that point, because that's completely misconception of how open source works. So if we can make the explanation of this model transparent, we make the knowledge accessible, why can't we make that model itself and the data in double code available to people? And the more eyes will look at it, the better they'll improve this algorithm. We know we can learn from encryption algorithm in many years back, how it was difficult to open source it, but it only gets better when it was open source. I believe AI will benefit a lot if they open sourced the procedure. On the other hand, I know that we define open source from the software engineering perspective. We should be able to sit down and talk with the AI community. Might be our definition will become more inclusive and capture some areas. So I don't know.
Did you want to jump in?
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You have highlighted a lot of the challenges that open source AI, or defining what open source means for AI means, because there are so many different layers. It's not just the source and the binary, like Mark, you were saying. The data aspect, the architecture of the model, the training software, the inference software, all those pieces, all those components, they come with their own set of challenges and understanding of what open means, and the implications of openness when it comes to the sovereignty that developers and users have on the system as a whole, have a different impact. So if we go back to the early days, we had a simple way to tell people, to tell companies, to tell governments, if you're deploying a new software system, make sure it's open source, because that will grant the public access to explainability, access to the control of the solution, and have that sovereignty over that digital implication or the digital life. We have to find similar things into these separate different aspects, and as communities, as open source communities, we became very familiar with copyright law, and we tend to think about slapping copyright over everything, on data, on trained models, on binary objects, and all of that stuff. it may not be the same. And think in terms of copyright, like who has the ownership of data, like my blog or my pictures. But we may want to have to challenge all of those assumptions when it comes to AI.
Thank you. That's really great. And I think, one of the things that I'm hearing from you all is that there, even people that have access to all of this training data, the people who created the models, did all the work from the beginning, they don't actually fully understand why when you ask it a question, you might get two different answers. Like or why sometimes it might give you a really insightful answer. So I think that this sort of reproducibility question, which we kind of take for granted, if you have enough transparency and it's all math, surely you can reproduce it. But there are just times where even the people who've developed these technologies, they have no shortage of access to how it was built, can't fully explain like why it does what it does. So that's just another level of complexity. And I think as we become more impressed by the power, there's also this concern of if we don't know how it works or why it's doing what it's doing, even if we're impressed by it or it seems to be useful, we really should have pause and reflect on that, because that's sort of uncharted territory for us. And now I want to actually go to a question. We got a question from the audience, and the question was related to monetization. So if open sourcing the models, if you're open sourcing the models, by what other means might an organization monetize their efforts? Pam, do you want to start?
Yeah, I have kind of a non-answer to that question, but this is what I tell people. Particularly when you worked at Red Hat, the first question that everybody asks you is, how does Red Hat make money? And, I've been answering that question. I've left Red Hat more than 10 years ago, and I'm still answering that question when people find out I worked at Red Hat. And the answer I give is you're thinking too narrowly. So we are so accustomed to the thought that I have an intangible product, an intangible property that I can sell a license to, and that is how I'm going to generate revenue from that. That's how I'm going to generate that revenue. And people have a really hard time to think more creatively about other ways that that when you take away that that model, that that ability to monetize that license, what other ways are useful? And if we look around, we see that open source is used everywhere, and people are using it not because Red Hat is kind of an unusual company in that Red Hat, SUSE, are unusual companies in the sense that they are monetizing software per se, but by doing it by providing support and services for that software. That's the model they've chosen on how to monetize open source. Where you take someone like Facebook and Google, they use it as a platform. They're not monetizing the software per se. They're monetizing services, other types of services related to it. So I think just using that as examples, I think to say, I need to monetize the model itself is, people need to, just kind of take that away and say, okay, what is the business I can operate? What am I trying to do? What can I do that will make money in other ways? And I'm hoping that Stephen has something a little more concrete than I have in sort of that advice.
I think, Pam, I think you're exactly right. The way that we talk about this with our clients is basically, you need to stop thinking about sort of making money from the software, making money with the software, right? And there are a bunch of different reasons for that. One, selling software these days is much, much harder. Right, you have sort of a ton of competition, and even with some of the some of the AI pieces, as sort of innovative and advanced as they are, they're not without competition. So if somebody's charging you for one, in many cases, you can go get a free alternative somewhere else. Might not be quite as good, but it'll do sort of a lot of what you want. So the question is less like, hey, how do I monetize this software directly, than what are the models that it enables? And in so many cases, if you look around the industry, people are sort of applying the licenses to software. They're not actually, that's not where the majority of the revenue comes from. The majority of the revenue, for a lot of businesses, commercial open source businesses, comes from them actually running the software and operating it as a service, right? In a lot of cases, the licensing for the software itself as a discrete asset is pretty minimal, sort of as a percentage of revenue, with the majority going to, hey, I don't want to run that, I don't want to operate it, but I'll pay you to do that. And that's sort of one very common model. So I think Pam's exactly right. Really, everybody gets wrapped up in, I wrote this, so somebody must pay me for it. And it's really not how things work most of the time today. That's not where most of the revenue for software is coming from.
Great. Steph, do you have anything to add before we go to our final question?
I like to think about restaurants, where in general you have entire industry of books with recipes, and still lots of restaurants are making money. So the knowledge of how to make a meal is fairly available. Think about the and that would be my software thing, but there is still a lot of industry knowledge and capability of generating revenues from cooking meals for someone else. So in that analogy always helped me understand the business of open source in that sense.
Good. I like that analogy. Well, for the final question, I'm going to kind of turn the conversation around and sort of upside down. And rather than talk about sort of what open source means in the context of AI, I want to ask, what does it mean when AI is actually writing code, when machines are writing code and contributing it to our open source projects? We have, these co-pilots, these coding assistants. People are really starting to use these and find utility in them. They obviously are not perfect, but they seem to have some utility. There's some stats out there about just how many developers are starting to use these assistants, which are, writing the code. And so if some of the code is being written by machines, maybe more and more over time, and that's coming into our open source projects as submissions to be reviewed, what are some of the implications of that? And certainly a lot of those probably are in the legal realm. So start with Pam to field this curveball question.
Yeah, so this is where my clients are freaking out, and absolutely justifiably so. I think, as kind of as Stephen said at the outset, this has developed so fast, and as lawyers who are trying to evaluate the risk on the generative AI models in particular, like our heads are spinning because we just have kind of no clue. Someone else commented, and I think it's very accurate to say, if you go to your developers and ask them, are they using generative AI tools to write software, and they say no, they're lying to you. so it's something, it actually is exactly the question, 12 years ago with open source software, is if you go and say, are you using open source software, and they say no, they're lying to you. It's very parallel to that. So we kind of have to just figure out, and obviously the biggest concern and the biggest legal threat where the lawsuits are being filed right now is the ingestion of data, and whether or not that is lawful to ingest data the way that these LLMs have been doing it. There are people who are, it's fair use. They're just staunchly believe it's fair use. I would say my position is, I unfortunately, and fair use, exactly, these questions are very fact-based. So I don't think that there is one size fits all answer to, as much as we would like to be able to just wave a flag and say, oh, it's fair use to have ingested this. I don't know that's the case. I think it may depend on what the purpose is, what the use is, what's done with it, who the audience is for it. Our fair use world just got more complex with the Warhol decision out of the Supreme Court. So even just answer. So on one, the lawyers are concentrating on the two ends of the equation, which are, is it lawful to ingest this data? And the other end of it is it infringement? Is what spits out at the other end possibly an infringement of someone's copyright? And I think both of those questions are unknown. We know anecdotally, for example, that when Copilot was first launched, it would replicate the GNU, the GPL v2 because it had seen it so many times. Like if you started with a blank file, that's what it would generate. So, how do you say, if someone were to enforce copyright in that was not a copyright infringement. Kind of no matter, the copyright system doesn't care too much about how you got to the end result. So it's very possible, and there is something called unconscious, subconscious copying, where you don't realize that you've copied, but the end result is so similar to the origin work that you sort of, you must have copied, and there is liability for that. So I put less weight on what happens in the middle. And I think the input question is, we have no clue whether or not this is ultimately going to be decided, how this data use is going to be decided, and there are lawsuits, and we may find out. On the outside, is it infringing? So if I take that generated code and I plug it into the code I'm working on, am I infringing someone's work? It depends on, I don't care so much what happened in the middle. I'm more concerned. The legal question is, how similar is it to that original work? And then and what makes it more complex in software than I believe it does in visual works or works of fiction or other kind of works, are that software also has a highly functional component. So software tends to have a narrower copyright protection anyway, because functional need is not protected by copyright. Saint-faire merger, there are these doctrines that allow people to use what needs to be used. So those come heavily into play in software in copyright cases. So we're all just swimming as fast as we can to try to figure out answers for these questions, and to be able to give our clients at least some understanding of the risk that they're taking.
One thing that I would like to add at this point is also that we have the opportunity. We can also start thinking a little bit of like it's a blank slate. Like really, the courts are going to be deciding based on the laws that exist today, but this field is moving so fast and new laws are being written. I think we have the opportunity to influence the policymakers and ask them to write the laws that we need for a functioning society in this space.
Yeah, I think I agree with Stefano. And just to throw a light here, the future of software engineering, like what the pioneers from Microsoft Research suggested in one keynote at ICSI some few weeks backward, is this generative model will be writing code and software engineers will be doing more of the review. In that context, I look at it as co-authoring. Now, if we just go a little bit one step backward, all this Copilot and generative model that produces code have been trained by codes that different people used. Then that is where Stefano comes in to say, okay, the laws should also reflect that reality. Because if you train a generative model with my code and you deprive me from using that, then we should also think about that. And now it gives us a template, a boilerplate, where I could effectively now complete the code. So it's co-authoring. And I think that is the future of software engineering. So we cannot just wave out that reality. And I mean, it's debatable and something that the law will definitely address.
Thank you. Well, those are great answers. It's been an awesome episode. It sounds like individually, if we want to monetize open source, we should go to law school. But it seems like we're going to need more lawyers. So Pam's well positioned. But anyway, we're running out of time. But I want to just thank all of our panelists. It's been an amazing show. I know that we didn't get to all the questions, but we'll have more upcoming episodes. So thank you all for being on the show. And I want to actually just wrap up and talk about thanking our sponsors one more time, our Open Infra members. And these are the members that make it possible. And also want to mention one of our next shows, which is August 24th. We're going to be talking about the CRA, the Cyber Resilience Act. This speaks directly to this question of what's going on with all the laws that are coming down the pike that might impact open source. And this one is a pretty much a hot topic, hot potato. If you're not paying attention to it, you should be, and you'll get to learn more about it on our show. If you have an idea for a future episode, you can go to ideas.openinfra.live. Thank you again to all of our guests, and we will see you all back on Open Infra Live August 24th. Thank you, and have a great time with Open Infra.